Hello, my name is Geoff Withers, and I am the lead for the local government group in the League of Women Voters Colorado Legislative Action Committee. The League is a nonpartisan organization that promotes good government, and I'm here to introduce you to three people from whom we will hear about metropolitan districts in Colorado and some of their residents' frustrations. We in the local government group follow legislation concerning local governments that appears at the General Assembly in Colorado. The last few years have seen a spate of bills in the legislature concerning metropolitan districts, and this has led us to delve deeply into the ins and outs of metropolitan districts. The local government team is very fortunate to have these members because they all three have the experience of living in a metropolitan district and discovering that things aren't as they had seemed when they moved into their house. Each one of them has done a considerable bit of research and has learned a great deal about metropolitan districts over the last few years. And they're really truly the residents' experts on the subject. First, we'll hear Christina Manthey, who's the chair of the Jefferson County League of Women Voters. She also lives in a metropolitan district and can relate her experiences as well as those that she's heard from many other people. Next, we have John Henderson, an attorney experienced in land use law. He's represented defendants as well as land developers during his storied career and has a wealth of experience in the legal profession. And to close out, Fayre Ruszczyk, a resident of a metropolitan district, who has learned a great deal more about metropolitan districts than I think she ever wanted to. She's become somewhat of an expert in many of the legal and administrative documents that underpin the operation of metro districts. I'll turn the program over to them now.
My name is Christina Manthey, and I am a member of the Jefferson County League of Women Voters and the League of Women Voters of Colorado. The League has been on a journey of examining the functionality of special districts in the 21st century. The League is well known for its interest in voting at all levels, but we are also interested in government action at all levels. The League understands that without active citizen involvement in government and the protection of the right to vote, our democracy will disintegrate. In 2018, a GeoffCo League member approached me about her property tax bill. She was new to Colorado and was puzzled by her property tax bill. Coming from New Jersey, she was unfamiliar with the various types of taxing districts on her bill. Her curiosity led to the GeoffCo League beginning an analysis of the modern metro district work, which in turn led to the GeoffCo League notifying LWVCO that we believe that the League could make a difference in the area of special districts and specifically metro districts. The Colorado League has a long history of interest in local government. Our first positions on local government were written between 1959 and 1963. In 1986, the League of Women Voters of Colorado revised its positions on special districts to the following. Special districts should be more difficult to form and should be consolidated, dissolved, and/or multi-purpose in nature whenever possible. The financial accounting of special districts should be improved and mill levies limited. Services should be provided by existing units of government whenever possible. Guidance and supervision from a central agency are desirable. The League is specifically interested in metro districts when we're evaluating reports from metro district residents, determining how metro district laws and practices measure up to support two essential elements of self-government, elections, and voting. We also are looking at election law as it affects metro district and metro district documents. Today, we have several speakers discussing the metro district election voting. John Henderson will now begin the discussion about election laws and metro districts. John?
Thank you, Christina. My name is John Henderson. I'm an attorney, have a master's degree in public administration, but more importantly, I've been spending over 40 years doing what we're doing right now, and that is researching and reporting, educating on issues of concern, land use issues of concern to residents and communities. I used to live in Solterra, moved there about 7 years ago, and in the course of doing some work on behalf of a group that was supporting Dinosaur Ridge, I came across these things called metro districts. And I've been an attorney for a long time. I've done a lot of land use work professionally and as a volunteer, and all of this that I do here is volunteer. And notwithstanding all that experience, I never heard of a metro district. So I started beating the bushes and doing research, and sure enough, found documents like the ones we're going to show you here this afternoon, and have been evaluating metro districts, educating folks with questions about metro districts, and working on metro district reform where the opportunities present themselves. All the last 7 years, all volunteer, all with an effort to share with everyone what I've learned in order to sleep at night, because there's a lot going on here that people should know about. So let's talk about metro districts and just some introductory background. Keep in mind, we're talking about a government. It's a real government. It taxes, it spends, does just about everything governments do. But it's a different government because the ones we're talking about here, metro districts, specifically dirt districts, don't have any people in them when they're created. Now, we're familiar with creating governments where people get together and decide they want to form a government, and they give up certain rights in order for that government to address things for the benefit of everyone. This one's a little different. There are no people there, yet there are people who are creating this government and imposing government obligations like taxes and debt on residents who will move in later on. So we are paying particular attention to this because it's really a little different. Now, these governments are created by developers, and keep in mind, it's not like land use regulation where a developer is entitled to do what he wants to with his land. That really doesn't apply to metro districts. In fact, the statute creates a presumption against creating a metro district. The developers really have a high burden to prove there's a need. Unfortunately, it's not enforced regularly because cities and counties didn't realize that's how it worked. But at any rate, there's no right to a metro district. And second, keep in mind that the relation that the developer has with the city and the county in developing that piece of land, the site plan approvals, all of the variances, the zoning, all of that is still an established relationship between the developer and the city or the county. It doesn't have anything to do with the district. The district is there to provide a mechanism to pay back the developer for the cost of the pipes in the ground. Now it's also evolved to take care of things the district ends up owning, like pools, rec centers, tennis courts, streets, and sewer pipes. So we're talking about a government that's a little different from what we're used to, and it's a government that is regulated, and it's a government that generates a lot of money. So we're going to talk about elections and voting with respect to metro districts. And we're going to look at see how the practice and the statutes and the documents measure up to the fundamental elements of self-government, particularly in terms of elections and voting. We're going to look at how these governments are created. We're going to look at how you know about an election, the right to vote, the right to serve on a board, and ultimately vote for who you want to represent you. We're going to look at the kinds of elections. We're going to look at who votes and how the districts are managed in order to facilitate that voting on important things like spending money, like issuing tax debt. We're going to look at election laws, and we're going to look at Metro District documents, and we're going to get some input from residents. Election laws. Here's the Colorado election law, 372 pages. We are not going to go through even part of that. We're going to cite to it. Just want to make sure you know it's there. Good compilation and a good reference. The documents, Metro District documents, it took me 3 months, 7 years ago, to find the documents related to our Metro districts. It's a lot easier now. I do it in about 2 hours when I do Metro District evaluations. We're going to look at several of those documents, and an obvious point about them. They're created by the developers, the developer council and consultants, and they are found publicly, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are found publicly on the Department of Local Government Affairs, in court files, and through Colorado Freedom of Information Act requests. As I say, the topics we're going to look at is, number one, how do we find out about the right to vote and the elections? What kind of elections? Who gets to vote? And how are they managed? Notice. This is a real notice, by the way, on a fence post. We had one in our community that was dangling from a barbed wire fence. And this is the way some Metro districts provide notice to the residents about things going on in the district. This happens to be a notice of a meeting. They're obligated to designate a place where they will put notices, and sometimes they end up in the middle of a field. But the point is that notice is important, and the legislature has defined what notices are appropriate for elections. The first one is the self-nomination election or self-nomination process. You decide you want to run. You put in a self-nomination form. Well, when do you do that? And how do you know to do that? Until recently, the only way people found out about that was through legal ads in a weekly insert in a major newspaper like the Denver Post. Not very effective. So recently that statute was changed to require actual notice through mail and email. And it has had a tremendously successful response. In the last year, too, since that was passed, many residents have self-nominated because they knew about it. And they've run for elections, and they've started to take over control of their district boards. So the notice of your right to nominate is taken care of in the statutes. The notices of elections, that there's an actual election coming up of any kind, is still using the old definitions and the old criteria, which generated notices on fence posts and notices in legal ads in weekly portions of papers like the Denver Post. So perhaps an opportunity there, but in any event, there is a difference between the current way notices are provided between the election on the one hand and self-nomination on the other. So let's talk about the kinds of elections. The first point is legislation actually says what we all know, but it's really important that they say it. And that is, elections are an essential component of self-government, particularly in the case of metro districts. So elections are important. There are three kinds that I'm going to talk about: organizational election, the Tabor election, and the board of directors election. Now, the first and the third are very easy. The organizational election, that's how things get started once the service plan is approved by the city. The developer gets together with family employees, and they vote to approve creating the district, and they vote themselves into office on the board of directors. Again, no people around, just rattlesnakes, prairie dogs, and occasional Mountain Lion. So they vote to approve the district and set themselves up as the board of directors. Later on, after the district gets started, and certainly once the residents arrive, there are elections for the board of directors. And those elections happen every 2 years on odd years. There are also things called special elections. But those are two elections that the statutes provide for and are fairly routine. The Tabor election is a little different. The Tabor election, we're familiar with, is when the government says to the residents, okay, under the Colorado Constitution, we need your permission before we issue debt. We need your permission before we increase taxes. And we need your permission if we're going to keep money that we didn't spend from the last year. In this case, in the case of metro districts, when the developer has his organizational election, he almost always has a Tabor election. Don't have to. Tabor election is really designed for the residents approving bond debt, but they have one before the actual residents arrive and move in. And this is an important election, and we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at this and looking at the documents. Here is an excerpt from a document that I use a lot in evaluating districts. It's a bond prospectus. Now, these metro districts issue bonds to pay back the developer his costs of putting the pipes in the ground. And the bond prospectuses give a lot of information to the potential investors about what this is all about. They run anywhere from 150 to 300 pages long. And in this one excerpt, they say what I said just a few minutes ago, and that is under Tabor, there is a requirement to get voter approval before issuing any debt. And then in the next paragraph, it goes on to say, as to the district in this case, they had that election. They had that Tabor election that I referred to earlier. They had that Tabor election at the same time as the organizational election, when there were no people, just prairie dogs, rattlesnakes, occasional mountain lion, and the developer and his employees. And at that election, in this case in 2006, those folks voted to issue $600,000 in debt and up to $4.9 billion in repayment costs, which would be the principal and the interest. This was a debt authorization, basically like voting in a credit card limit that they could spend against. And here's what that ballot actually looks like. And you see the vote was 8-0. So 8 folks sat around the table and they did 3 things. They voted to increase the debt authority from what was in the service plan, in this case, from 60 million up to 600 million, and the repayment cost of 4.9 billion. Now, when I moved into our community, and when most folks move into their metro district, they have no idea that this ballot issue was voted on. They have no idea that they have outstanding debt authorization hanging over their head up to, in our case, $4.9 billion. And it's hard to find this document. Sometimes it's listed on the DOLA site, but I've more often than not had to go to court files to find it. The other thing this ballot issue does is set a maximum interest rate, in this case 18%. And then in the language that follows, or roughly halfway down, this is the language that essentially says, we are authorizing this amount of debt. And because we're authorizing this amount of debt, we're delegating to the board of directors the authority to actually spend this money to issue bonds up to $600 million. And all of that's going to happen without ever asking the residents for permission, because they're voting here to authorize that much debt. Essentially, it eliminates the right of the residents to ever vote on actually issuing bonds. Here is an example of another ballot issue, but this ballot issue is taking place, this election is taking place when the residents are already in control of the district. And it's not a vote of 8-0. It's not a vote to issue debt authority up to $600 million. It's a vote to issue $8 million to do certain projects that they're scheduling. And the vote is 1,900 people to 1,100 people. The residents voting to issue bond debt. This is what a ballot issue looks like after the residents have arrived, and their right to vote on issuing bond debt is restored, either through the expiration of time or reversing this ballot issue that is issued before they arrive. So who are the 8-0 folks who voted for issuing this debt? In our community, it was 2 officers of the developer and their employees. They're listed there, 1 through 5. In other districts that I've evaluated, it's family members, the developer and his family members. In any event, it's folks who don't live there, don't pay taxes, and will never live there or pay taxes. And as we'll see later on, these are folks whose interests are different from the residents, because all that money that they're authorizing in debt is to be paid to the developer. So the folks who are voting to issue these debt limits are the ones who are going to benefit from that vote financially. And the residents who are actually going to pay that debt don't have an opportunity to participate in that decision-making process until either they take the seats on the board or 20 years expires. So how does that happen? How do people who don't live there and who don't pay taxes get to serve on the board? Well, the statute addresses it 2 ways. One is prairie dogs, rattlesnakes, mountain lions, they're not going to vote. The developer, his family, employees aren't going to live there, don't pay taxes there, and don't intend to, but they're the only people around. The residents who are going to live there aren't there, and because the developer has issued this ballot in order to create the opportunity to issue debt, there is going to be a time lapse. So under the statute, they can vote, but they have to be qualified as eligible electors. And in order to be qualified as an eligible elector, they have to have a contract to purchase taxable property. Now, to be clear, the statute first says you can't do that. They're prohibited from qualifying people to be on the board, just to be on the board, by giving them this taxable interest in a property. But then there's an exception, and the exception is if there are no people or there's nobody who wants to run, if no residents wanted to run. And if that plays out and nobody wants to run, the elections are canceled. Here's a notice in our community. Elections were canceled for 11 years because, quote unquote, nobody wanted to run. Here's what that looks like on the DOLA website. Their website only starts at 2012. If this website showed our elections from 2006, it would show they were canceled from 2006 until 2018. So the contract, what does this contract for the purchase of taxable property look like? Well, here's an example. These 5 paragraphs basically say what the statute says. You can't serve unless you're an eligible elector. You can't be an eligible elector unless you have a right to purchase, or you have a contract to purchase taxable property. And getting into the detail, here's how that works. In this case, the cost of the property is $600, and the person who's being qualified as an eligible elector is getting 1/6 of that, so $100 to that person. Here's how he pays: 10% down, $10, and the closing for the rest of the $100 will be, in this case, March of 2027. Well, the elector in this particular case had a term that expired in 2023. So this closing, the payment of the rest of the money, was scheduled long after his term actually expired. And here's that parcel that he purchased a 1/6 interest in. It's about 4 feet by 12 feet, and in an area of the development where nobody will live, typically a retention pond or other open space. Now, the opportunity for the developers, employees, family members to sit on boards until the residents take those seats is a critical element. It's an important part of how metro districts work in practice. And if you talk to residents, you quickly learn that there's quite a bit of tension in making that transition. In our case, in Solterra, we had to recall the developers off the board in a very contentious series of proceedings. But we were successful in recalling them off the board, and then residents taking their seats on that board and beginning to make the decisions for the district. But there are ways to manage the district in order to affect how soon the residents are able to take those seats, and even once they do take the seats, what powers they have to decide taxing and spending issues. And one of those events is creating master servant districts or a community authority board and the developer agreements. So what's taking place here is the use of the statute in building a district, structurally building a district, in order to manage the residents' access to making the decisions about how to tax and spend. First, we'll talk about master servant, then the CAB, and then the developer agreements. Here's what a master servant district looks like on a map that's filed with the Department of Local Government Affairs. That little sliver that's marked as District 3 is the developer district, the master district, sometimes called the servant district or the operational district. This is a small piece of land. In our case, it was 10 square feet. Small piece of land. No one will live, often in retention ponds, open space. But even though no one lives there, and even though it's land that will never be operational, it has 5 directors, and the developer appoints his family members or employees to be the board of directors for that small piece of land. Then the rest of the land, in this case District 4 in the shaded area, is where the residents actually live. And those residents have a board that also has 5 people on it. During the evolution of the district, from the point where there are no people to the point where there are a lot of people, it takes a while for residents to realize that they have the right to sit on those boards and then run for elections. That has accelerated in the last couple of years with that notice provision I talked about earlier, where people get actual notice through mail or email about the right to self-nominate. But in any event, there's a transition. In our community, it took 11 years because, unfortunately, residents were told by the developer that they couldn't serve on the boards until there was build out of 75%. So that delayed residents getting on the board. But in any event, what happens in the master servant districts, and we'll see in the CAB as well, is that there are these things called pledge agreements. We'll see an example here. So you create this one district with a very small piece of land, but 5 developer employees and family members running it. And you have another district, which ultimately will be residents. And you have a pledge agreement that establishes the relationship between those 2 districts. And that pledge agreement that is entered into by the developer with himself, because he's running both districts at the time the pledge agreement is signed. In this pledge agreement, the developer agrees with himself that all the money from the residence district will be paid to the master district, and the master district will decide how to spend that money. We'll see an example here shortly. In the CAB, a similar relationship is created with another layer. We talked about the master servant, the master district run by the developer, the servant district by the residents. In the CAB, they create another layer, what I call a super district, to make decisions for all the districts. And it typically requires the developer breaking the district down into even more districts than 1 or 2. So the CAB, Community Authority Board, as you see there, the purpose is to basically run the district. It'll be the governing body. But here's the twist with the CAB. Under the master servant, the master district is 5 people employed by the developer making the tax and spending decisions. Then you have the residence district of 5 people. Here with the CAB, with multiple districts, they give the developer district 5 votes on the CAB and the residents only 1 vote, thereby guaranteeing, ensuring that for the entire length of time the project is running, or until the developer decides to leave, the developer will always have a majority of the votes. And graphically, here's what that looks like. This is a map of the district. The tiny little yellow box, number 1, is the developer district. And the blue area and the green area are resident districts. And all of those districts have representatives attend the meetings of the CAB, and the developer has 5 votes on the CAB, and the residents only have 1. The CAB document includes a provision that requires the residents pay all of their income to the CAB, and the CAB, with their 5 majority vote by the developers, the CAB then decides how to spend the residents' tax revenue. Similar agreements, pledge agreements in the master servant districts as well. And you'll see that the districts also agree to impose the tax rate that's set by the CAB. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road. This is a budget in this particular CAB configured district. And you can see this is the budget by the resident districts, District 3. It shows how much money they have coming in, $1.6 million, and how much money they spend. But you see there are no line items for how they're spending the money. There's no decisions on whether to spend it for this project or that project, or these vendor services, taking care of the swimming pool, mowing the lawns, what have you. No, all of the money is simply paid to the CAB. And here's the CAB's budget. The CAB, Community Authority Board, with the 5-member developer majority, actually spends the money, and a lot of it. And of course, their priorities may be a little different than the residents' priorities because they're still trying to sell houses. In one example, in Aurora Highlands, also a CAB, the developer had a line item in their budget. The CAB had a line item in its budget to spend over $2 million to erect a very large entranceway, $2 million. It was so tall they had to get permission from the FAA to build it as high as they did. Different priorities, different agendas between the developer majority and the resident majority. And I say it's an agreement with themselves, the pledge agreement, the CAB agreement, the agreement in a master servant district, a fundamental, incredibly important agreement that the district relies on heavily, where in essence, the developer agrees with himself that the residents will pay all of their tax revenue to the developer, and the developer will just decide how to spend it. And here's a signature page of the CAB. In this case, similar to everyone I've seen, including every master servant pledge agreement I've seen, and I've looked at probably close to 100 of the districts in the last 7 years. Yes, it's the same person signing for everybody, including himself, as the president of the developer corporation. And as I said it in the very beginning, the developer, his family members, his employees have a different focus, a different agenda, different priorities than the future residents, because the money that is being generated is actually going to benefit the developer and his company. And the residents who are paying that money, who may have different priorities and a different agenda, are not participating. And here's a note in an audit that expressly says, as it must, and as it does for every audit I've seen in Colorado metro districts, that where the board is comprised of the developer, his family members, and employees, where the board is a developer board, they have a conflict of interest with the residents. And this is important. In the CAB context, in that case, they issued, with the developer majority, $99 million in debt. And an important element of that debt, of course, is that it's tax-free. I've appeared several times in the last 3 years before legislative committees considering legislation that would address issues in metro districts. And I want to share with you a recording of testimony that was provided by industry representatives who are describing that pledge agreement, where the developer agrees with himself to have the residents pay all of their tax revenue to his district. And there's also testimony here about why it's important to get that bond debt created as soon as possible, all of which is designed, again, to focus on repaying the developer for putting the pipes in the ground. We'll play the tape now. 3, 2, 1.
I have a question. And I do want to reiterate that we're not talking about metro districts in general or metro districts issuing debt. We're talking about a very specific aspect of that. And to that, then, is there not a mechanism for the developer to be reimbursed under several mechanisms that is separate from the developer then buying his own bonds and benefiting from that initial reimbursement at a very high rate? We'll go Ms. Tanaka.
Okay, Madam Chair, and then I'll toss it over to Mr. Thomas, if you don't mind. Yes, there is an agreement commonly entered into, which is a reimbursement agreement with the developer. And that does include a cost verification process and an interest rate component because they're carrying that cost. The issue is that at some point in time, if there's a loss of guarantee that will be repaid, it's converted into a debt. And so at first it can start as an annually appropriated agreement that gets outside of the definition of debt under Fayre. But at some point that can be converted over if they've not been repaid by a certain time, just to ensure that they can get that money out of it. And that's when you start to see that conversion over into an actual debt instrument. So there's kind of a birthing of that at that level initially, and then it ends up converting over into a debt at a certain point in time.
Where am I? Please proceed if you wanted to answer.
Sure. I think the other component that's important to point out is the reimbursement agreements are subject to annual appropriation by the board. A goal of a district is over time you transition to residents, and those residents, unless if there's a compelling obligation to pay for those infrastructure improvements, they might not choose to do so. So it's a big risk factor. If I'm going to front the money to build infrastructure and I don't have some sort of recourse to know that I'm going to get paid back, then that's a massive risk factor. So there is a mechanism in place, but unless there's a debt obligation, there's no compulsion by a future board to actually pay for any of that.
The recording we just heard, again, was from 2 industry representatives. And in the first, the testimony addressed the reimbursement agreement, which is the second half of the pledge agreement, where the residents pledge to give all of their revenue to the developer decides how to spend it, and there is this agreement that the developer being reimbursed for his costs. The second speaker essentially said, we need to issue bond debt. We need to get the bond debt issued as quickly as possible, essentially before the residents take over the board, because they may not pay that debt back once they have control over the board. And that is a fundamental premise, a fundamental element of this metro district model. That is to say, the developers want to make sure, they want to guarantee they get paid back what they think they should be paid, and they want to lock the residents in to that payment before the residents have an opportunity to vote on spending and taxing decisions. I'd like now to take an opportunity to introduce Christina to you, and she's going to talk about some of the obstructions to elections and management of the elections. Thank you.
Colorado is very proud of being the gold standard for its general elections in the nation. There are a number of areas that prevent Colorado from receiving that kind of praise for their special district elections. First, special district elections are held in May of the odd years. May is not a time when people are thinking of participating in elections. Voter participation, as a consequence, is low. Voting is one of the ways that citizens are able to participate in their government. So this is important. Next, each district runs its own election. This means that there's no common mailing point. There's no central ballot being mailed out. There's no automatic mailing of the ballots because each special district determines its own rules on how the ballots will be issued. The voter is responsible for tracking down their own ballot for each special district that they are eligible to vote in, and the voter is required to notify the district election officer that they, the voter, would like a ballot. It doesn't come automatically to them like it does in a general election. Because every district runs its own election, the elections are run by private entities such as a law firm, and these elections are very expensive. Somewhere in the vicinity of $40,000 to $80,000, whereas if they were run as part of a general election, they would be around $4,000 to run. Yes, there is an extensive manual regarding elections that is posted on the DOLA website. While this manual exists, there are multiple DEOs, designated election officials, interpreting the manual. There's no central authority coordinating these interpretations. The League has uncovered numerous instances where significant interpretations, such as when the DEO is required to notify DOLA regarding a canceled election, and they're quite wide in variety. It's important to notice that the return of ballots are not necessarily returned to a public ballot box, and these ballot boxes are not under observation 24 hours a day, unlike the general election. Special district ballots may be returned to a private law firm that has very little public scrutiny regarding the security of the ballot box. There are also other issues that affect the rights of voters in a metro district. Next slide, please. First, the ability to recall a board member is limited. You must obtain at least 300 signatures or 40% of the electorate to have a recall of any board member. Another issue in this area is that the DEO hired by the board and not appointed by the electorate controls the election. And that means the existing board controls the recall process. This process lends itself to the existing board becoming intransigent and possibly making inappropriate demands of the citizenry. We have an example on the screen. Second, and this is very important, there's no provision for citizen initiatives in the area of special districts. That means if the board does not agree to bring up an issue on the ballot, then it's not brought up because there's no board member supporting it. Next, Fayre is going to discuss the proliferation of special districts.
Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I learned more about metro districts than I ever wanted to. My name's Fayre Ruszczyk, and I live in Dancing Willows Metro District. I'm a native Coloradan who has lived here my entire life. I graduated from the University of Colorado, and I taught in the public schools in the Denver and Colorado Springs area. My husband and I have owned 5 homes, but it was not until 2010 that we purchased our retirement home in a metro district. We had never heard of a metro district, and when we were asked to sign a document stating that we understood we were buying into a metro district, we were told that it was like an HOA that would pay for our pool and community center as well as snow removal on our streets, but that it was better because we could deduct it on our taxes. After moving into the district, we discovered that it entailed much more than that. We discovered that there was a bond debt associated with the metro district that was incurred by the developer for payment by future residents, and that the county was not responsible for any services in our neighborhood. We were even responsible for paving our own streets. When I took it upon myself to visit with a recently elected Jefferson County Commissioner, he told me that the very first week of his term, a developer with his attorney came in to tell him how wonderful metro districts are for the county, because they would lower county expenses. When I asked if the county could take over the paving of our streets, I was told no, as the streets do not meet code. As a result, I subsequently found and joined a group of like-minded citizens who also live in metro districts and feel that they were not given appropriate disclosure or none at all. In addition, I learned of many more issues that exist with metro districts. Since that time, our group has worked tirelessly to try to enact change through the legislature, but to no avail. So now I'm going to cover the numbers of local government, the numbers of metro districts, and the numbers of homes that you'll find in a metro district. As you can see on this slide, the increase in local governments from 2016 to 2023 totaled 1,045, or an average of almost 150 per year. At this rate, we could add another 1,500 local governments to Colorado in the next 10 years. The number of metro districts increased by a total of 838, or 120 per year. Applying this number to the next 10 years, you could expect growth of 1,200 new metro districts. This slide illustrates the number of local governments and metro districts by county according to their population. Of Colorado's 64 counties, 37 of them are in a metro district. This chart illustrates the counties whose metro districts total more than 20% of their local governments. Adams and Weld counties in particular have a large number of local governments compared to their counterparts. Of their local governments, 71% are metro districts. Please keep in mind that each of these metro districts must have a board of directors and conduct elections every other year without any help from the county clerks who normally conduct state and local elections. Therefore, designated election officials must conduct the elections. These officials often have conflicts of interest when conducting these elections, as they are employed by the legal counsel of the developer. Often, it is left up to the electors in each district to determine who their designated election official is in order to request a mail-in ballot or to even know where to go to vote. And I might add that 90% of all special district elections were canceled this last election. There is also a great variety in the sizes of metro districts, but regardless of their size, each has the same responsibilities. They must hold elections every other year in odd years, and each district must have a budget and file audits, among other responsibilities. This slide illustrates 4 different sizes of metro districts in Adams County. As you can see, they range in size from 89 homes to 1,851 homes. But regardless of their size, each is required to file a budget and pay certain expenses. I have parsed out the budget items that they all have in common on the right. You can analyze the data for yourself, but please note the range in budgetary costs that range from $53,000 to $198,000, and the cost per household range of $107 per household for the largest district to $600 per household for the smallest. And now John will finish up with some personal experiences by residents.
Thank you, Fayre. In the next series of slides, we have excerpts from statements made by residents in metro districts recounting their experiences. As I may have mentioned earlier, I've been working for 7 years on evaluating districts for individuals, and this is just a very, very small sample of some of the things they've had to say about experiences in their communities. In this first one, which happens to be my former community, the speaker explains they were there from a very early part of the development. He and his neighbors frequently raised questions about being able to serve on the board and obviously participate in the taxing and spending decisions, and was told by the developer that they could not sit on the board until the development was built out 75%. When we were knocking on doors to get signatures for our recall petition to recall the developers off our board, I heard that repeated over and over and over again. And when I explained to the residents that the statutes gave each of us a right to serve on that board as soon as we moved into the community, and that the developer had been canceling elections for the past 11 years, and the reason for the canceling those elections was because nobody wanted to run, the neighbors would sign my petition. In the next slide, we have a resident who received a phone call from the developer's attorney, who is also the district's attorney, asking her to withdraw her self-nomination to run, so that the developer majority would continue on the board. And on her own investigation, she tried to determine, well, how would these developer employees have a right to vote if they didn't live and pay taxes? And she found the contracts indicating that they had, in 2 instances, 1% interest in the property. In this slide, we have a interchange, an exchange of emails between the designated election official and a resident who is trying to self-nominate. And again, the designated election official is oftentimes a paralegal for the attorney representing the developer, and the exchange oftentimes isn't as welcoming as it might otherwise be, because of the relationship between the designated election official and the developer. Again, received information, in this case from another neighbor who had a relationship, a formal relationship with the developer, discouraging the residents from running and upsetting the majority that the developer has on the board, arguing that one, it will be too expensive to have an election, and they should just be satisfied with the developers populating the board and avoid the cost of an election, and that it's important to have the developer continuing to run the board to complete the development of the community. Our interest on behalf of the League was to try to determine the extent to which the laws and the practices, the documents, measure up to supporting 2 critical essential elements of self-government: elections and voting. The topics, again, we looked at how do you find out about it, the kinds of elections, who votes, how those votes are managed, some of the obstacles, and the real-time dynamic created by the proliferation of districts, very small districts that have to meet the same kind of expenses as larger districts. And at the end of the day, it's clear, and I think fairly stated as true points in this discussion, that the Metro District model requires development control. As we heard in the tape, the industry representatives explained one of their objectives is to make sure, is to guarantee that the developer gets paid back what they think they are owed for the cost of installing the infrastructure. So they require control over the taxing and spending to make sure they get paid. On the other hand, fundamental elements of self-government require resident control over taxing and spending. There's a conflict. Developer control of taxing and spending is in conflict with resident control of taxing and spending. And the developer control of elections and voting is in conflict with resident control of elections and voting. A critically important topic. There's a lot of money at stake. There are a lot of votes at stake.
Thank you very much again for your attention. And you should know that we've only hit the tip of the iceberg in the way that metro districts operate, and there are other practices and issues that we could talk about if we had more time. But if you have more, if you're interested in any more or have any questions about anything that you've heard today, please get in touch with us at the email address that's on the slide. Thanks again.